founding the company, what it looked like.
That first 2 years, we got it up to 15 people and profitable.
What are you excited about in the next few years?
What's the future of politics? Are there rules? Can we make primary systems more transparent?
I don't think we live in a world where you can't offer that level of transparency and be successful.
Positive politics is all about getting more of these people in the game.
What are you doing on the back end to try and push that movement out?
Can we get to a place where like food and medicine are so cheap that everyone gets it for free? It's possible that that happens in the next.
Welcome back to another episode of Beyond the Wealth podcast. I'm your host, Andres Sanchez, and today I have Neil Thanedar. Neil is the founder of Labdoor, Positive Politics. He's an 8-time angel investor, 4-time political advisor, obsessed with this new thing that I recently heard when I started listening to you, which is investing in scientist CEOs. Obviously, those accolades right there alone can give you an insight into the type of conversation we're going to have. Neil, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So I want to just start and allow you to give a quick pitch on yourself. I'm sure I missed some stuff there in that intro. Tell everybody who you are, and we can kind of go and start diving in from there.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah. So born and raised St. Louis, Missouri. My dad ran testing labs growing up. And so when I was 2 years old, he quit his job and started his own one-person testing lab. I saw that grow over 20 years. While I was in college, he was trying to sell the business. Thought he was going to get out and retire and have a happy life. And it was 2008 recession, and he had a couple bad quarters. Bank took the business. He fought it for a couple years while I was in college, and he lost everything. So 2010, I'm in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and we're trying to figure out what's next. And so he and I basically were talking over the phone for months, and we convinced him to move up to Michigan. He and I started a testing lab in Michigan. Started just the two of us, built it to 15 people in 2 years, 50 people in 6, sold that business. He got to retire. I got to have a great life afterwards. It really led me onto this path of testing labs are so many. There's thousands of testing labs in the United States, but basically 99 plus of them all work for the companies. They work for B2B. They do testing for manufacturers, brands, behind the scenes. You never see the data. And so if a product fails, you don't hear about it. Versus what I would love to see, and what Labdore does now over the last 12 years, is we independently test the products, pull them right off shelves, test the best or worst fish oils, multivitamins, protein powders, creatine, now all these unique herbal products. We even tested like light chocolate versus dark chocolate, all these different categories of food and supplements and anything that could affect your health. The purity and the accuracy of those products are so important. And so we've now tested over 1,000 of these products. We publish the ratings and reviews for free. And it's a way to research and buy the best products. And so Labdoor.com has been something that has been a passion. It's been also a business that we've raised $7 million. It's been profitable now for 5 years. And so we've gone through the full startup process, first from raising seed and Series A financing, going through Y Combinator and Rock Health to really top accelerators, and then transitioning from the VC-backed company to the profitable, self-sustainable company over the last 12 years has been a challenge and has also been a lot of fun.
That's amazing. And I want to give people listening an understanding. What is a test lab? I'm sure that's a super general question. But when you talk about building these test labs and even explaining that some of them work B2B versus what your angle is, can you just touch on that a little bit?
Sure. Analytical testing lab tests products. And so there's two different types of labs, the ones that test products and the ones that test people, basically. And so you might have seen like a clinical lab, like a Quest or a LabCorp that tests like your blood or your urine, things like that. And so that's like people testing versus analytical testing. We're testing products. So we're testing medicine, supplements, food, and we can test the purity of those products. So we can test, are there heavy metals, lead, cadmium, arsenic, mercury? Are there PCBs or other pesticides in a product? Are there now plastics or microplastics, phthalates, all these other BPA? Anything that you would see on a label as like BPA free, we can do those types of tests. And so there's a wide range of tests that can be done. And usually companies will do that testing for quality control. And so this kind of B2B testing is like the company pays a lab, 90% of the time it passes, 10% of the time it fails. The customer never hears about it either way. It's just like very quietly taken care of behind the scenes. So what Labrador does that's different is because we buy the products ourselves, we test them independently, we can actually publish those results. So if 10% of products fail in a certain category, we can publish that. In fish oil or certain other categories, as much as a third of products or more will fail testing because either the fish oil is not fresh or a bunch of other reasons. The heavy metals, the mercury level is too high. And so we can publicize all that. We can tell you what the worst products are. And ideally, we tell you what the best products are. And then becomes like the rankings for every category or what's most popular for us. So you can go in and see what's the number one protein powder on the market or number one fish oil on the market. We'll have all the places where you can buy it. You can buy it direct. You can buy it from the source you always buy it from. We get a commission no matter where you buy it or whichever product you buy. And so it's just a marketplace for researching, finding, and buying the best supplements.
And maybe I'm wrong, but I have to imagine the equipment needed to test these products is extremely expensive. Is that accurate in thinking that? Because I'm thinking through and like the barrier to entry is low from the aspect of you could just go buy the products and start testing them, but I'm sure it's extremely expensive to own the equipment and have the knowledge to actually be able to test these things and be credible.
Sure. Yeah. So I think the testing itself, so the analytical chemistry equipment itself can be, hundreds of thousands of dollars per piece of equipment. So the heavy metal testing is hundreds of thousands of dollars. Active ingredient testing, you might need multiple of these equipments that are also in the six figures each, right? So it can be, $1 million plus to build a lab. Or if you actually had to send it out to another lab, it could cost you thousands of dollars to test a single product. And so those are kind of ways to think about how much it costs. I think one of the things that both kind of a testing lab, a B2B testing lab or a consumer driven testing lab, in both cases, you just have to you're like trying to centralize a lot of testing. So if you're a consumer lab, you're trying to test thousands of products in the same lab. If you're a B2B lab, you're trying to do the same. And so the coordination of basically how to scale from, $0 to $1 million in revenue, $1 to $10 million in revenue, those are really key factors in a testing lab, they're much more revenue driven than being in Y Combinator. And a lot of the other startups in our classes might have been they might have been a social media company or a delivery company or a B2B, software company. And in a lot of the ways, their product is so much more important where they're focused on building and maybe making no money up front. And then they're expecting to make more money later. Whereas we were actually pushing and we had to try to drive for revenue and try to build cash flow early. One, because we wanted to be more self-sustainable, but also just because this testing is really expensive. And so we wanted to figure out a way to pay for that testing. And so that's a big part of any of these businesses is what's the turnover? How quickly can you test? How many products can you test? It's been a focus of mine for a long time.
And you mentioned Y Combinator. Obviously, this company was started when you were coming right out of college. You were trying to figure it out. A lot of our audience is that 20 to 35-year-old founder who probably knows exactly who Y Combinator is and is a goal to be part of Y Combinator or one of those big accelerators. Talk to us about that time in this journey of founding the company, what it looked like and what it was like to, and I know Mark Cuban was also part of those seed rounds. So what was that part of the journey like for you?
Yeah. So I think one of the best things that helped me was starting that first company. Like me and my dad, when I was 21 years old, we started Avemain. So that first lab, it was like 21 to 23, basically this first 2-year sprint. He then ran the company for another 4 years. But that first 2 years, we got it up to 15 people and profitable. And we were in a really good place where we knew how to scale from kind of 2 million to 10 million in revenue. But that first 0 to 1, 0 to 2 was the most important. And then it's like I'm 23, 24 starting Labdore. And I tell a lot of people this, Y Combinator, a lot of people, half the people there might be brand new companies, like 0 to 6 months old. But a lot of the people who come into a Y Combinator will be 1, 2, 3 years old. And they're basically looking to transition the company or make the company bigger. And so Y Combinator can actually be a great finishing school, like graduate school for startups in a way that the very first startup, our accelerator that we went through, Rock Health, that was in 2012, that was the company was 6 months old, first $100,000, that really kind of changed the company's life. We moved to San Francisco. It really kind of opened our eyes and like made us see what the startup industry is really like. And then we built for then 2 years after that before we went into Y Combinator. And by the time we got to Y Combinator, we had a good sense of what the business was. So we had tested hundreds of products. The website was live. We had apps. What changed after Y Combinator is they really pushed us on like how big the business could be. Could we really like zoom out and think about how does this become $1 billion business? Who do we need to talk to? Like, what are the additions that need to happen for that to take place? How do we pitch the company differently? Like, how do we pitch investors better? It also pushes you because in our class, it was the first time they took over 100 companies in one class. So, but even then, that's a relatively small group of people. And I think, 4 or 5 of those companies have already become $1 billion companies and more on the way. And so you end up in this place where that's why I kind of compare it to like that kind of what I would imagine Harvard would be like. I went to Michigan, so I don't really know. But the like that of startups of that, like, what is the like, these are the potentially like the 100 or 200 best companies of the year. To me, I thought about more being like drafted or something that is like, if you're 21, 23, 25 years old and like, these are the like 500 best startups of the year or the 500 best founders of the year. And it pressures you to be better, right? It's like, imagine like everyone else is like the best in their town, right? But like when you show up here, like now this is real. And you're seeing people even in like a 12-week period, they might get to multi-million dollars in revenue in that 12 weeks between them and day. And some of those companies might have actually like pivoted halfway through. Like they had completely different ideas than they came in with. And so the pressure of that and just like the excellence around you, I think is really great. At the same time, I think the partners are really, really direct and they just like will tell you exactly if you're right or wrong. We went through in 2015, so we got like direct meetings with Paul Graham and Sam Altman and all these different people. And it's just wonderful to see kind of them push you and actually like a Paul Graham say like, what is this company really going to be long term? And we had really pushed it. We had thought about it both as a business, but the thing that is like in our heart is the alternative to the FDA. Like we really think that like the FDA does this testing or is supposed to do this testing. They require clinical trials for medicines, but they don't require any pre-market testing or regulation of these supplements. And so what we'd really like to be is a worldwide alternative to the FDA. And when we were pushed into that, we talked about that a lot, but then you always kind of, you pull away from it when you start talking to investors and you start focusing on how do you make money and you kind of start pitching it as, oh, we're an affiliate marketplace. So you start defining it by all these technical terms versus what YC always, I think, really pushed us to is like, what's the like biggest possible mission? Like what happens? How does the world look different when Labdore is maximally successful? And how do you push for that? And I think that has always really stuck with me. And I love kind of the pressure of being able to like be in that environment and be around people who are the best. That like that ambition is so much fun. And that's something Paul Graham writes about is like putting that many ambitious people in a room together is just, it's exciting and it makes everyone better. And so I love that about YC.
Yeah. I mean, I relate it back to even when I played sports. Like if you were a high level athlete and you wanted to compete in your sport, you went to these things called showcases. And it was a mix and mashup of all the best kids from all over the world, all doing the same thing in front of each other. You feel this different type of energy. You feel this different type of excitement around what you're doing, even though it's stuff you do every day in practice, but it's because you're trying to impress the person next to you. People are saying that person's better than you. You don't think that. And like YC and something like that, I could see how you're getting all of these. I mean, if you're an entrepreneur, you're already extremely ambitious. If not, you wouldn't be doing it. Now put all of the best of them in a room and say, hey, they said that person's better than you, or that person's business is going to be bigger than yours. And I can only, I mean, we've already seen it. We've seen all of these success stories that have come out of it. So it's so amazing.
Yeah. And I love how focused they are on weekly metrics, right? And so it'll be like Tuesday dinners. And so your Tuesday afternoon to evening will be at YC. And the rest of the week, they want to leave you alone. And like, you want to work, but they're very precise when you show up and there's like small group and then you go and you have dinner with the big group. And in each case, like you talk to your small group and you say like, we grew like 11% this week or 15% this week. And like everyone knows the weekly growth rate. Like imagine like a lot of these like huge corporations are like, we grew 30% this year. Right. And like in YC, it's like, well, I grew 12% this week or like 15% this week. Right. It's like, that's what people are pushing for. And that I really do believe is like daily, weekly measurements versus monthly, yearly measurements. It does matter. It's like at best, corporations are talking about quarterly earnings or something like that, right? Versus like what we think about weekly. The more you can compress those cycles, that's a big part of YC and just like being a professional. And so like we use that, like being a pro, even like when I talk to my co-founders, we're like hiring people, we're hiring an executive. Like that's a true pro. Like, and there's like something about that is like they can play in this league, they can play at this level, is like one of the top compliments you can give when you're trying to like recruit or hire someone.
That's amazing. I want to, our audience here, like I mentioned, is a lot of these aspiring founders from all different walks and in all different industries. I know for a fact there's someone listening or a few people listening right now that are passionate about biotech. And you watch some of your other interviews, you can see the passion from your end when it comes to investing and empowering what you call these like science CEOs. What advice or what playbook would you give to somebody who wants to go and start a successful biotech company right now?
Yeah, I think a lot of people already have the science, and I think that's the hardest part. And I got pushed into it in both Avmean and Labdore, being the scientist and the CEO. I think it helps. I think we're still 20, 30 years behind what tech has. Like, the developer CEO is now such a normal thing. It's like the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world, where it's like, it's obvious to tech founders or YC is that the founder can actually build what they're talking about or what they're dreaming about, that's an advantage. The scientist CEO is a similar concept, especially in biotech, where the creation is science, right? And so if the same person can be both the creator and the business person in the same person, there's some magic there. And so I love to see that wherever possible. I've made a couple of angel investments in the last 2 years on that very thesis. And so right now it's all angel investments. I look for ideally founders who the first $50,000 or $100,000 can go a long way to if you're working with a single scientist CEO. So there's one in the UK and one out of Berkeley that I'm working with right now, and in both cases, it's the founder who are kind of working on these cases, or a founder plus one other scientist can build the product. And so you have these 1 or 2 person startups with $50,000 or $100,000 raised can go do a single trial. Right. And that's such a powerful unit. It's something similar to what YAC might think about, is like, how quickly can you deliver something valuable, right? Like something people want. And in biotech, that's just seemingly so difficult. I think it's pitched as biotech always needs hundreds of millions of dollars to operate. And I think that's increasingly going to change, where the $100,000 could change what used to need $5 million might be $500,000, like Mike Maples would say. It might even be $50,000 now, where that like single study you can prove in a 12-week trial it works or it doesn't work in one situation, which is enough to then raise the 500,000, which is enough to get the phase 2 done, which and then you raise the 5 million to do another trial. And so I think this idea of the phasing structure does work in, like, pharmaceutical companies know how to do that. And so it's possible to actually break those phases into more steps. And then it looks a lot like the pre-seed, seed, Series A, Series B, Series C that like any other startup can do. And then all the other skills, I think, are much more transferable than people would think. So like I've seen so many scientists where like you just throw them into a CEO role, and it's fine. Like they learn accounting. They don't enjoy it. I don't enjoy it to this day. You learn legal, you learn marketing, you learn all these other things. A lot of the stuff's natural, especially if it's like a biotech product. You might not have to sell that many people. You might have to sell investors, and you might have to sell a few key partners, right? And so sometimes also the scientists are the best person to pitch, right? Is like they know the product inside and out. They love it. It was their idea. Some cases, like especially in biotech, you'll have like a personal illness or like something that like a friend or a family member that like there's all these great stories where if you empower the scientists to run their own company, instead of what a lot of VCs do is they turn it into like a studio model, or they take over the business and run it themselves. I would just prefer to empower that scientist. And so still think science is 20 or 30 years behind that, but it's getting there now. And so I'm curious to see like what's like the next Genentech or the next Facebook of biotech. Are there platforms? Are there things that can be built now? Biotech's got so much potential right now.
I mean, you're getting me excited just listening to you talk about it.
Awesome.
Something that popped into my head that I thought would be an interesting from your perspective. You've obviously been around a ton of extremely successful founders. Now you've flipped the script and you've gotten the chance to invest in other founders. What are some of those standout characteristics that you saw or that you noticed other people saw where you could kind of identify like this is a 100x founder, this is a 10x founder, like a very successful individual?
Yeah, I think it's hard to. It's just I think there's like a little bit of a game recognized game thing in the like the passion and the excitement. I think there is. I love just like riffing on ideas with people and just like seeing how deep we can think about it and how quickly we can go. I think that's something you think about in YC. It's like fun when the way like I talk and a lot of people in YC talk is just like it's very fast, it's very direct. Sometimes you're like we'll try to pick. In what I love about YC partners is they'll kind of pick to the like the meat of the problem or like what's really wrong as quickly as possible. And if you're like dancing around the idea or if you're scared of something and like you're not saying like, you know, like the company didn't grow this week. And so like you didn't say your growth rate this week. Like we all noticed that you didn't say your growth rate this week, but like what happened? Like what's wrong? And like let's talk about it. And I think there's something about either like the founders who have just like whatever angle or like whatever you thought about, like they've gone down that road. They've like thought about it, they've experimented in it. They know if there's like a dead end, they know why. And they're like, I already went down that path. It's fine. It's not as actually as good as you think. Or like we've tried it, but like we need more research. Like we need like $250,000 to go down that path. And like, they'll know like exactly the cost or the meaning. And so I like the more time I can like spend and riff with it, the better. At the same time, like what YC does is amazing is like it's one application, which like takes them like an hour or two, and then 1 or 2 10-minute interviews max. They make a decision. Like in 10 minutes, they're supposed to know. And so I think there is something to be said for as an investor, if you can, to try to sharpen your skills to where like how early can you figure that out? Like how early can you catch that signal? That I think is a skill of YC, especially. For me, it's like the people who I've invested in, like my best investment was to this day has been Paystack. So it's like a company that was in YC. I met the founder. He was like in the 2016 class. I was in the 2015 class. And so I was able to like, in some of these cases, some of my best investments have just been people I knew for 6 months or a year before I invested. And so that's like sometimes an unfair advantage versus the YC that has to make a snap decision. That said, like there are more companies I should have invested in YC. I wrote like bigger checks. So for me, like a $5,000 or $10,000 check was really big, especially as I was starting my startups. And so I missed a bunch of companies. So I like would do like 1 or 2 a year. I would like save up and make 1 or 2 investments a year. And I missed companies that were X because I was like saving up for the 20X or the 100X. And so maybe that's a lesson that I learned was like, maybe I should split it up into $100, $1,000 units and like made many more investments. Maybe I would have learned more. Maybe I would have grown more. Investments are doing fine. I think that's a lesson for especially like new angel investors is I think people think they need thousands of dollars or like hundreds of thousands of dollars to become an angel investor. With like WeFunder and Funders Club and all these like cool platforms, you can invest like $100 into a startup. I think getting into that expertise of just like putting $100 down and then watching it for years and 5-10 years down the road, you see an exit. I think it's just such a valuable skill. And then if you ever do want to be like a real like VC, that portfolio becomes such a huge deal. Like if you can show any sort of investor or LP later that you've invested in 10 companies or 20 companies or 50 companies, even if it was $100 each, it really does make a difference where you're like, I know how to put a portfolio together, reasons why I invest in each of these companies. I'm following up with them. I know who my top 5 out of the 50 are. I know who I think my number 1 is. And other investors love seeing that. Like you can basically build an entire investing career if you ever wanted to, just by like building a portfolio and showing that you can do it. It's a very underrated exercise. It's like something that I think more founders should do while they're founders, because you're around more founders when you're a founder. A lot of these VCs, like they age out, and like the longer they've been away from startups, they don't have those connections anymore.
That is a very cool way to think about it. And I think we've traditionally, and I say we, like people who aren't in that VC circle or haven't been at the high level of let's say the quote unquote founder world, don't even know that investing $100 into a startup is a possibility. So I appreciate you sharing that. And what were the websites that you mentioned for people listening?
Yeah, so WeFunder is a site that I use most frequently. They actually are a Y Combinator company as well. Funders Club is also a Y Combinator company. And so those are 2 great platforms. And we've done that. We've actually, Labdore has raised money on both Funders Club and WeFunder. on principle now. So like we haven't needed to raise money in a number of years. So what we do these community rounds, which I think is also like a really fun. It works both ways. So like it helps the investors where like you're like $100 or $500 or $1,000, you can get into a company and you can invest and you can follow along and you get the same percentage return whether you invest 100 or 1,000. It also helps the companies because instead of you end up having like if 500 or 1,000 people pool together $200,000 to invest in your company, now you have this like pool of people who are your fans who have like put money down on your company. And it's like, it's almost this great in between being public and private, where I think that there should be easier ways for companies to be able to, like anyone to be able to invest in startups. That's something I've written about too. And it's like a bills that I've actually been trying to push in Congress. There's been multiple opportunities where like bills have passed the House, but not the Senate or vice versa for this very specific issue, which is that most people have not been able to invest in startups historically, right? So historically, only accredited investors are allowed to invest, especially if you're investing directly. You have to be able to write usually $5,000 or $10,000 checks minimum. A lot of startups will ask for $25,000 or $50,000 minimums. And so it's just like impossible for people to invest. But the combination of these platforms like WeFunder and potentially just like actually removing accredited investor laws entirely should allow like anyone to invest like $100 into a startup. I think there's just so much potential there, both for the startups and for the investors, that's just like being left on the table right now. So an interesting connection between startups and politics for sure.
Well, I think that's a great segue into talking about the other stuff that you're building. So obviously, one, you've alluded to your writing, and we talked off camera. Well, technically the camera was on, but it wasn't rolling. That you've got this passion for writing, and you've written 100 essays now. And you have now been a political advisor 4 times for your dad, who has ran for office. And you've mentioned this big passion for politics, and talk a little bit more on what you're building in that space.
Yeah. So for the last 8+ years, 4+ cycles, it's been mostly helping my dad first run. He ran for governor and lost, ran for state rep and won, and then ran 2 terms for U.S. Congress and has won both those times. And so between kind of 3 primaries, 3 general elections, I've seen a lot through the city of Detroit, the state of Michigan, the Democratic Party, the ups and the downs. There are very, I think, positive, and I've written about this, I think very positive things that the Democratic Party has done, especially around progressive populist policies. And I think Build Back Better had a lot of childcare and family leave and like a lot of benefits that could have been great if they had gotten into law. So I think I'm always looking at, in the last 4 years, I had been looking at how can we push more bills through divided Congress and get more things passed? Can we make startup investing more democratic, right? Whereas like everyone is able to invest instead of just the 10% of accredited investors who have over $1 million, right? It's like the rule used to be is like, and it still is in most cases, like you need to be a multimillionaire to invest in startups, right? And like that shouldn't exist. And so there's specific bills that can be passed. And then there's also like specific people that I can help. And so I think with my dad, one of the things that we've really learned in Detroit is that there's it's a very working class city, but it's very diverse, right? And so you have a large white working class population, a large black working class population, large Muslim population, large Hispanic population that a lot of people kind of lump into kind of a city or like an urban community. A lot of politicians will kind of pitch a city the same way, like we'll pitch a Chicago the same way as a Detroit or New York the same way as a Detroit. And they're very different cities who have very different dynamics and very different people. One part of politics that I've seen work incredibly well is a focus on basically getting things done and focus on what I call positive politics. And so if you are trying to get just positive sum bills passed, or it's like accredited investing is like right now 10% of people can invest. What if 100% of people can invest? That would be good for the investors who would get access to some of the best startup, like 100x, 1000x or more deals. And a lot of these people are instead going to the stock market or options or crypto. There are a lot of risky ways that you can spend your money using your phone these days. And startups could be way, way better than that, right? They could be much more positive sum. And so I think focusing on positive sum bills is extremely valuable. And I think just politicians being positive with their words themselves, I think is the future of politics. It's 2024 right after election that was very negative. So I would definitely say that the current election and like the past elections have been pretty negative. And like, I think we've gone through a decade plus cycle of negativity. But I think that what I always try to think about is like generals are always busy fighting the last war. But if you are in politics, but you want to win the next election or the next race, like 26, 28 is coming up. How can we be more positive? What's the future of politics going to look like? And how can we encourage more of the next generation of politicians to be like that, potentially be like teachers and nurses and scientists. My dad's a PhD chemist, right? I think he's one of only 2 PhDs in Congress. And so it's like, if we can actually have more unique types of people in our politics, that I think is one of the biggest levers that we have to positively impact our world. And so I'm looking into ways to do that. I'm actually actively running for DNC member right now to be one of the statewide and national leaders of the Democratic Party, basically try to reform, like, are there rules? Can we make primary systems more transparent? Can we make the policies more populist and progressive? Can we kind of push a new generation of politics to be more positive? I think so. I'm writing the Positive Politics book. So I'm taking a lot of the writing that I've already done, plus just like writing every day and just like putting it in. It's now in a book format. It's 40 plus pages. I'm just like another kind of 4 months at this pace and I'll have a full book. And so in 2025, goals are publish that Positive Politics book, number one. I'd love to get a YouTube channel started on Positive Politics. So podcast, interviewing people who are doing that already. I think that there are a lot of great politicians nationwide who are doing some good work. And then an event, like I could do one live event, like a Positive Politics conference or some live event, would be a great 2025. So that's what I'm looking forward to. I think it's a very different kind of business. I think I'm completely bootstrapping it. The book is completely bootstrapped, like no editor, it's just me and a laptop writing. I mean, 40 pages in, like I have the structure of the book, the table of contents, the chapters, just filling it in at this point. And I just think the more I can kind of push that whole mission and build, a small business around it, but a business that goes like directly for my passion. I call those like middle class businesses. Like the Germans call them Mittelstands. It's one of my most popular blog posts. Is like, we need a middle class for startups. It's like, I think as much as I love Y Combinator and like Y Combinator is about being like the number one star, I think there's like something really cool about the like a small to medium business that is like totally self-sustainable and is like directly the passion that you love. People who make clothing for a living and like they're designers and they love doing that. I think whatever it is that's your business, I love that. And so for me, if I can make between a book and a podcast and events, a small business around politics, which is enough for me to then go all in myself, start running for kind of internal offices, smaller offices, and build up from there. I think there's something really special there. And I think the next 1 or 2 decades, I would love to see Positive Politics be the future. And I'm pushing it. My dad's pushing it. Some of these candidates, I'm just really trying to find more candidates that I can help. I've helped a few candidates, actually, like Y Combinator founders and like other founders I know. For various reasons, their lanes weren't open this cycle, and so there were other people who were running. And so I've helped people who have great potential futures in politics, and I'm just looking for more. I'm helping more people. And the same way that like scientists can be great CEOs, I think startup founders can be great politicians. And I'm always very curious around the people who can do many different things or where are the crossover skills or where are the benefits. I mean, startup founders are extremely driven. They know how to brand and market themselves. They know how to brand and market organizations. They know how to build teams. They know how to sprint. They know how to measure things on like daily and weekly metrics versus monthly and yearly. They know how to fundraise usually, right? They are fearless about getting on a phone. All these things, these are the things that you need to be successful in politics. And so I think book and kind of the movement in general of Positive Politics is all about getting more of these people in the game.
I think you're onto something with that startup founders going into politics. Like even the way you phrase that on like the basic skills that a founder would need to be successful is almost the exact playbook to what a politician would need to accomplish to be successful. Obviously, as long as they're running on a good platform and good message. So I'm curious, what types of levers or what are you doing on the back end to try and push that movement out and have that become a reality?
Yeah, so I think a book's going to be a key part of it. I think interviewing people and spotlighting the people who are already doing it, I think would help. So I'd love to talk to I think Andy Kim in New Jersey, Jeff Jackson in North Carolina. There are a few really great congressmen, senators, attorney generals who are kind of all over the place who are really pushing this right now. And so I think it's also like to focus not just on the politicians, but the activists. I think there's some really interesting activism stories. And so I think pushing more of those stories, I think one of my favorites is Gregory Watson. This is going to be in the book, but he was actually he was a college student at the University of Texas, like in the 70s. And he got a C on a paper where he was like, there should be constitutionally amendment for if like a congressman wants to like raise their salary, if they like pass a bill to raise congressional pay, that shouldn't take place until after the next election. It's like they should have to win an election to get a raise. Like they shouldn't just be able to give themselves a raise. And he got a C on the paper and he was like really pissed at it. And he went and worked for like a decade and it's now a constitutional amendment. Like that now exists as like the 27th Amendment, whatever it is like this. And the University of Texas eventually like retroactively gave him an A+. Like they actually like changed his grade. And they're like, cause like going above and beyond. And there's people like that, like Katie Fahey in Michigan, who got a state constitutional amendment passed in the last few years, right? And it's like all these great stories of people who you can just like take a single bill or a single amendment and just run with it. And so I think that's the other thing that I think startup founders could be really good at is, and I'm trying to pitch that too, is like, you don't necessarily have to be that politician on TV that's screaming and shouting. One solution is like, you can be positive and win. And like, I'd like to share that playbook as much as possible, but you can also just like, you can get into activism and you like try to solve the problem more directly. And that may be what you want. Like what you really want. I have a lot of startup friends who got into education startups or healthcare startups to try to change that part of the world. And it's possible that you could spend 10 years on a healthcare startup and solve some tiny problem in billing somewhere, versus like you could fight for 10 years for universal healthcare and completely change the entire system, right? And people don't necessarily think about it that way, but startups are built around, 10 plus year journeys. If you spend 10 years on politics, you can get a very long way, especially on a specific issue. So I'm also trying to broaden the idea of, and so the book and my articles are all about what are more examples of not just politicians, but activists who have just like picked a lane and sprinted for a long time and just like see how far they got and how much different our lives would be if more of us did that switch. I'm trying to convince, as I'm doing it also, is like I'm kind of actively making that transition from startups to politics myself. I've like helped other people first, like helped friends and family first, then like started writing and doing my own work. Now I'm thinking about what I can do myself. There's easier ways to transition. There's also like, I love that idea of like, we talked about like multiple lanes, people who are doing multiple things at the same time. I think you can do startups and politics at the same time, right? And I think maybe that time that a lot of us spend debating politics on social media, we can spend on activism, like on a specific issue. There's nonprofits that need to be created. People can found the nonprofits. Like startup founders might be very good at building those organizations or those teams. So yeah, all those places, you can be like a campaign advisor or campaign manager part-time, especially in local elections. There are just like so many routes into politics that it's like, we kind of just like stare at like the presidential race every 4 years and like, that's one very, very narrow version of politics. And there's thousands of seats nationwide, plus, millions of opportunities to be an activist. And it's just about like picking your lane.
I feel like I'm getting more and more curious as we talk here. You are at the tip of the spear on two very important industries, biotech and politics. And I'm curious, what are you excited about in the next few years, like in general? Are there any technologies that you're really pumped about? Are there anything that you're seeing in politics that is getting you really excited? This is just a question straight from myself of just curious.
Yeah, part of my writing is alluding to this. I think what's exciting about science, biotech, politics, it's the idea of abundance is really interesting to me. Is I think that you could get to a place like biotech is not just about making new medicines. It could be about making new industrial products in different ways, right? It's like, how can we make chemicals in different ways, plastics in safer ways? How do we make food in more efficient ways? Can we get to a place where like food and medicine are basically like so cheap that you just like everyone gets it for free? It's possible that happens in the next 50 to 100 years, right? It's possible that energy gets that cheap. That's like the idea of like energy that's too cheap to meter is like, if solar power gets as good as it continues to get as good as it's getting, we get better at capturing that energy, right? And like battery power and battery technology gets better. And so we're able to store this energy for longer. You get to a place where like all the like essentials in life, or more of the essentials in life, become like extremely cheap or free. And so for as much as we talk about like things are inflating and like things are getting more expensive, there's also like a lot of things that are getting cheaper fast. Energy is getting cheaper fast, and water desalination could be getting cheaper fast. Like the way to like make water pure and like take the salt out of the water and like take all these things could make it so that like we're not going to have as many wars because people are not fighting over food and water and energy and resources and gas and oil. That is where like the future could be. I almost think it's like the positive optimistic, like the Star Trek future instead of like the Star Wars future. Like the Star Wars future of the like we're all going to be like fighting and there's going to be like nuclear bombs and like dictators and stuff, right? Like there's something like that like negative future, and then there's the like Star Trek abundance, like we're multiplanetary and everything is wonderful, and like maybe there's some fights in the edges, but like for the most part everyone is happy. That is like in our lifetime could happen, and like in our kids' lifetimes for sure could happen. And so let's like make it happen faster, or like let's push the abundance, like both on the scientific and startup side. Let's like open it up so that we can build more and like do more things and have more science. And then on the politics side, let's find a way to like share that abundance. Like let's like if we can like build it and get it, like let's distribute that abundance to everyone. Like the idea of the like the future is already here but not evenly distributed. A lot of that might be true with abundance. Like the abundance is here in many cases, it's just not evenly distributed. And so if we can both like push the abundance first and then distribute it, I think that's like the job of startups plus politics. And so it's fun to be at the edge of both those. It's fun to just like be around other people who are excited about it too. And if there's people who can do both or multiple things, I love talking to people like that. It's fun, and it's I think it truly is the future of like of both. Abundance is the future of both, and you get to the positive future if you get abundance. And so it's a major unlock. I'd like to see more people talking about it.
I am one that pounds the drum on that we are literally living in the best time to build companies and to have ideas and to bring things to life. And I do think that we're going to, I mean, I'm 25, and I think that we're going to get to see what it was like at the beginning when technology was still so early. You were young enough to still like get excited about a new TV and different things like that. And to now, like, you have these supercomputers in your pocket that can literally, like you said, you can make or lose money way too easily on these damn things in your pocket. And I can't even imagine what it's going to look like in 20 years. I'm so thankful, and I know tons of other people like that are passionate about business and startups are so thankful that we're getting to be in this time right now where, like you said, there's tons of abundance. It's just about taking advantage of it.
Yeah. And so I'm thinking like people finding it is like the internet too. I think we haven't like fully gotten, especially in politics, like politics has not taken the full potential of the internet. And like, can more politicians like directly talk, and like every politician, like more politicians should have podcasts, and like they should be going on podcasts, and we should be able to like do the 1 hour talk, right? It's like, I love this idea that the medium is the message, right? And it's like, if we're going to talk for an hour, we're going to have a totally different conversation than if you're talking on cable news and you're like, you need to put your 30-second clips in between like 5-minute ad sections, right? And like, there's going to be like a pharmaceutical ad right after you. So like, you can't say too many negative things. Right. And so that's the way that medium is built versus this medium is built completely differently. And so I think the transparency and openness that positive politics needs also is built around this new transparent media that is the future. And so I think we're just scratching the surface of that. I'd love to see more politicians use it. And then when you're talking more long-term to people, I think the incentives get right. If you're talking like long-term, long form, then I think you are able to build a real relationship where you're like not trying to scare people in 30 seconds where you're like, we're talking for an hour, like, let's get into it. Let's get into the details. And so I want to find more people who are doing that.
Yeah, I think the consumer just demands more now. Like, I don't think we live in a world where you can't offer that level of transparency. You can't offer that level of authenticity and be successful. Like, people want to see who is really behind the person that they're voting for or the person that they're supporting. And now podcasts and longer forms of media have given us that opportunity where Now it's just a very real conversation, and you're actually able to understand who this person is, because other than that, it used to just be small clips, little blurbs, scripted messages. And I think people now are seeing through that, and you're seeing candidates that take that serious and want to be on those podcasts, want to get in front of thousands of people and allow themselves to be vulnerable. You're seeing the consumers or the general public eat into that and like that, because at the end of the day, we're humans. And I think when we looked at these politicians, it was like this figure, this person that we don't know much about, and they make all these decisions, and we feel like we don't have a say or we don't know that person. Now I think people are demanding more, and that's a good thing, because we want to know. And
Yep.
I'm excited about what's going to happen over these next few years. And as we continue to talk it, I feel like it unravels more that you, with this positive politics mission, have a huge opportunity to like be part of this big mission and create this huge initiative, which I think at its core will be so invaluable for politics as a whole.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate it. I want to push positive politics I've wanted it for a long time, right? I've like, and it's how I would run. It's like how I wish my politics would be. And I just think there's a gap there. And I think there's just there's a lot of my friends who I know who are the same way. It was like, I wish that politics could be much more direct and actionable and real, and just like, can we just like focus on the issues and get things done versus fighting all the time, or just like who's dunking on who, or like what's the gotcha question, right? It's like the like word games versus the action is totally different. And so I would love to see more of that happen. And so that's, I think, why I'm pushing for it. I also think because I was so passionate about it, or I cared so much, I was almost like I was watching and waiting for like, it's like, is it going to be now? Is it later? And there's something about this election where I was like, I really do think it's like I think Democrats have kind of learned a lot from losing a lot of this election, that they kind of felt that it's now time to do something different and get deeper into solving problems and directly talking about what they got done. And so I think it's like perfect timing. And so I think it's the same thing that happens in startups, and like the idea of being in the same industry for many years. Think that it's lucky, or you think that like someone who's done 1, 2, or 3 startups, or like someone who's run like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 political campaigns, like all of a sudden it's like, oh, like they came out of nowhere and they were successful. Like it always feels like that, right? But I think in the reality is, a lot of these kind of like overnight successes are really, 10 plus year overnight successes. And so I think in politics, the people who have been like thinking about positive politics and have been thinking about just like efficiency and getting things done are going to win like the next 10 to 20 years of elections, where people who like try to copy the like bombastic, angry politician will lose, because I think that we're tired of that. And I think it's increasingly, you've got to win the next race. That's the interesting thing about politics. I've got this like a countdown clock that's right in front of me, and like we'll count. It was like counting down to the election previously, and pretty quickly like reset it to like count down to the next election. It's very quickly. It's been a week and 2 days since the election, and you're like already kind of starting to think about the next one. And so there's something about that where I think startup founders are good at that too. You have a good day, you raise $1 million, and it's like you enjoy it for a couple hours, and it's like the next morning you have to get to work, right? And it's like that in both fields. I just love it. I'm a passionate, intense person. Like working with people like me, and I like working in fields that reward that.
I mean, I think anybody that's listening to this, watching this, can see the passion. And if you're not watching, I mean, I'm sure you can hear it as well. And I actually found that as one of the things that I was excited about before our conversation today, and watching your other conversations, is you have this passion. The authenticity is there. Like nobody's doubting that anything that you're saying is not something that you're super excited about and that you care about, which I think is a great attribute.
Awesome.
And
Thank you.
I feel like we could have this conversation for hours. But I will take us to the tail end of the interview with the question I ask all founders that come on the show. And it's kind of a basic one. It's, if you could go back right now and talk to the 18-year-old you with everything you know, what would be the one thing that you would say? Most people say, what would you tell your 18? What would be the one thing that you would highlight?
Enjoy college. I really had a great time in college. So I went to the University of Michigan. I met my wife at the University of Michigan. I met some of my best friends to this day. We still do like 1 to 2 trips a year. Got 2 degrees in 4 years, joined a fraternity, got into social justice and community organizing, led an organization called the Detroit Partnership. And so it's like, and then like had the full University of Michigan experience, had football season tickets, went to basketball and hockey games. And so like 18 to 22, I think there's like a lot of people who tell you